Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the Energy Newsbeat podcast. My name's Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. I got a little bit of a wild ride today for our podcast. I have Daniel Hood, and Daniel is a Civilization Cycles analyst. And a while ago, I had the geopolitical futures George Friedman on, and that went bonkers because people wanted to understand the geopolitical things going on. I've been reading and just giving a little bit of background on how I found you. I found you on LinkedIn, and we'll have your LinkedIn in the background. So thank you, Daniel, for stopping by.
Amen. Thank you very much for having me.
I'll tell you what, we were just chit-chatting right before the podcast, and you're amazing in your civilization analyst. Tell us what you do, because I was like, wow, that's a new title.
Right. Yeah. So it's a cool title. So basically what I do, I pretty much study the rise and fall of civilizations. And and of course, you know, if we're talking about civilizations, we can only talk about them in the context of what we see today across the planet, and of course what's happened historically. So when we think about civilizations, you know, we think about Greece, the city-states of Greece, so Athens, Sparta. We think about the Roman Empire. We think about the Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Persian Empire. And of course, we can't really understand everything taking place today without the context of you guys in the United States, the American Empire, right? or the kind of rules-based liberal international order. So that's what I do. It's really cool. You know, my background, I was a former soldier in the British Armed Forces, so I was a young commander. So I served before, during, and after 9/11. And, you know, for me, that was probably the first, what I call meteor strike, right? So this kind of wake up, really, that okay, things are not you know, not exactly what we thought they were after the fall of the USSR, right? And you know, we were kind of riding high, and America was the unipolar order, and then 9/11 happened, and everything changed on that terrible day. So I was out in Afghanistan. I was out on the ground in Iraq, and already, you know, we got to see the disconnect between what was actually going on the ground versus what was being sent back to our capitals and back to our nations in the US and the UK. And then let's see. And so after my military career, so I served for about 6 years, and then I took some qualifications in finance, and I ended up working in the city in London. So I went from geopolitics into finance, and that was before, during, and after the 2008 global financial crisis. So that was my second meteor strike off the back of 9/11. So those two events really peaked, you know, heightened my senses, and then I said, okay, things are not you know, things are not right. There's something wrong with our civilization, and maybe there are things going on that we don't understand. So I told you before your show started that, you know, when I was a younger kid, I first read Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesian War. So I must have been about 15, and that book blew my mind. You know, Thucydides was an Athenian general. Athens had gone up against Sparta and got their backsides kicked, and obviously Thucydides was banished. And whilst he had time to really think about what was going on, he wrote these great insights right into civilizations and so on and so forth. And then that just, you know, your mind runs wild. You say, well, how can, you know, such an incredibly advanced civilization, democracy, philosophy, so on and so forth, suddenly fade away into obscurity, and then that leads you on to other questions. Well, wow, Roman civilization, a derivative of the Greeks and a trusting. So you just keep reasoning, you keep asking questions. And then, if you're really switched on, you begin to detect these patterns. You come across these great scholars, Thucydides,
Right.
Sima Khan, right? So the Confucian scholar, Evan Khaldun, so the Mukaddima, the Islamic scholar, and Oswald Spengler, Germany, and you just go on and on and on and on, and before you know it, you've read so much, you're at the vanguard of this subject, and then you can start to see things and make contributions. So that is how I ended up becoming a Civilization Cycles analyst.
That's cool. Now, on LinkedIn, do you get a lot of backlash for some of your opinions?
Surprisingly, I don't. So it's very interesting. I timed it perfectly. With this kind of stuff, what I've found is that there was the world before COVID and the lockdowns and the world after. So you tend to find that, 9/11 was a tipping point in history. 2008 global financial crisis, tipping point in history. Brexit, tipping point. Donald Trump election, tipping point. And then we had coronavirus, the COVID, and the lockdowns, and that was an enormous tipping point in history. And I think that a lot of people who perhaps were asleep or just didn't pay much attention suddenly thought, hang on, what we're now, all over. I mean, all over the supposedly free Western societies were pretty much held at gunpoint if you walked out your front door. And maybe and you could see the kind of political divisions emerging with both camps, pro lockdowns and against. But I think a lot of people were traumatized by that event. And then off the back of that, we end up with this war in Ukraine. So since those two events, coronavirus and Ukraine, I've been a lot more proactive, and I'm very surprised. I've had very, very little pushback. In fact, I'm building a network in the thousands. So I have nearly 12,000 who have followed me and added me, and I believe in what's called the kind of alien methodology reperspective, or the autist methodology reperspective. So I try to kind of take my brain out.
Daniel, can you say, sorry to interrupt, could you say that again? Because it sounded like you believe in the aliens coming in from the outside planet. What was that?
Right. So I don't believe in aliens and UFOs. Okay. But if you think about the mind, you've got, if you think of the structure of the brain, you have two hemispheres, two distinct hemispheres. So if you want to get a holistic view or a more accurate perspective of what's going on, I'm a big believer in this idea that you need to be using both hemispheres. If you're just using one hemisphere or the other hemisphere, you're only going to get partial reality, right? So if you want to understand the big picture, you've really got to use all of your brain, not part of your brain, right? But it doesn't stop there, because there's a difference between perception and perspective. So perception is So perception is how we see the world, how we wish the world to be. It's our reality. But our reality and how we wish the world to be can be very different from how the world actually is, right? So if you want to get a better handle on what's actually going on, you have to literally have an out-of-body experience, pretend you are an alien looking down upon the planet and look at it from a different perspectives. So that's why I call it either the alien methodology or autist. Autists are they get to the truth of things, right? They just look at something and they're able to get to the bottom of things, perhaps over those who maybe are a bit more emotional or a bit more biased. So I think if you want to get to the truth of things and really figure out what's going on, you need to do those two things. So think holistically or laterally as opposed to linearly, and have this kind of out-of-body experience where you are, almost neutral, and you're just really trying to get a handle on what is. And it's very powerful, a very powerful framework for thinking.
I loved Daniel, I really love what you just said, because if you use both hemispheres of your brain, you're using the left and the right. And I'm almost ambidextrous because I'm left-handed. but I'm also very creative and I can think of all the different ways to make jokes on my wife. So, does that make me very left and right brained if you're ambidextrous?
Right, right. Well, I think so. I mean, I think that, I think that it makes sense, doesn't it? Like I said, if you just look at the
Right,
structure, if you look at the structure of the brain, you've got these two hemispheres, and you can have a dominant side and a not so dominant side. And I think that, certain brains are better able, you want to eliminate blind spots, don't you? I think that,
oh,
that's the brain is a sensing instrument, and in order
right,
to master the complexities, the incredible complexities of nature and the world, you really want to see things from many different perspectives.
right,
In fact, if you go to, if you want to be an intelligence officer, if you want to go work for the CIA or MI6 or
right,
Mossad or whoever, whatever, and then these are the kind of insights into human nature and cognitive thinking and
right.
psychology you will be taught, right? There's a difference between perception and perspective. So
Nice.
so yeah, so that's basically what and I think in order to be a good civilization cycles analyst, you need to have this ability to think laterally as opposed to linearly,
Are
right?
you left-handed?
So I'm actually right-handed, but I can use my left hand if I need to. But I'm my dominant side is my right side,
I
and
was watching your body language, Daniel, and for our podcast listeners, anytime you're moving your arm, talking very much, your left hand was coming up always higher than your right hand.
right.
So I love watching very much like investigators and everything else, body language. It is so fun to try to pick those things up. I guess bad. So let's step back a sec because when you and I were just visiting in the world of geopolitical issues right now, the world of energy right now, um, energy has changed society so much that energy is part of the economy. It's part of elevating poverty. It's part of geopolitical. People go to wars over energy. Um, Britain, and then right now, the U.S. has sanctioned Russia. They have weaponized the dollar in over sanctioning. I mean, that's my opinion. Let's back up to Britain. Britain was the gold standard. I mean, the world dollar standard. What were some of the things going on in the civilizations back then? Because you and I talked about U.S. and Britain are losing world influence right now.
Mm-hmm.
And when Britain lost some of that influence, what was going on there in that range? Does that make sense?
Right. Wow. Okay. So there's some really big questions there. So you're right. If you were, I mean, I'm a big fan of Jim commodities guru Jim Rogers. He was really
Right.
active in. So he set up the quantum fund with George Soros, right? And they nailed it. And in fact, I don't think Jim Rogers has spoken to George. I don't think he's particularly friendly with George Soros anymore. But I think he's a great guy, and he says it best, right? He says, if you were smart in let's say the 19th century, you moved to London, right? If you were smart in the 20th century, you moved to New York. And maybe in the
Right.
21st century, it's not going to be London or New York, right? It's probably going to be somewhere east, and we can kind of extrapolate and maybe kind of
Dubai.
just kind of have a think about why that is. But you're right. Look, Britain, of course, was the British Empire reigned and ruled supreme. Best scientists, industry, business, politics, you name it. And that was off the back of many hundreds of years of democratic evolution, right? So if you think, I mean, if you to really understand where Britain is today, where it was, at its peak of empire, you've really got to go back to. I mean, I live in Lincolnshire, which not far from the Humber River, where the Vikings sailed up, right?
Oh,
So
nice.
Rome, to think about it. So, Roman civilization began as a kingdom on a hill, emerged into or transitioned into this sophisticated republic, went empire, and then just completely disintegrated, right? And the Romans were here in Britain for nearly 350 years. And then around the 5th century, they turned around and they said, okay, Britons, you guys are on your own. We're done with empire. And they're like, what are you talking about? You've been here for 350 years. And Western Rome had stood for 1,000 years, right? So it stood for that. I mean, it was a huge cultural shock experienced by people of the ancient world when the Romans suddenly went away. Okay.
Right.
So Britain entered into a protracted dark age for 600 years. So we're talking, the fall of Rome around 476 AD to the Battle of Hastings, the Norman conquest. We'd had to deal with, we were having to deal with the Vikings for a few hundred years. But that kind of, once we kind of started to pull out of the Dark Age era, we entered kind of medievalism. Things started to kind of settle down, and it's interesting. One of the things that I do as a Civilization Cycles analyst is we look at religions, and we look at the power of religions and the impact of religions. If you think of politics, downstream you've got culture, and below that you've got religion. It's usually religions that are powering civilizations at their core. And of course, the dominant religion of the West was Christianity, right? And it was Christianity that was working away, within the communities, within the villages, certain towns, etc. And Britain and Europe gradually started to recover. We entered the kind of Renaissance period. We entered the Industrial Revolution, and it's interesting that I was born in Manchester, which was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, right?
Yep.
So if you look at Manchester at that time. And in fact, in places like Oldham, that is where you saw, the Victorian era or peak Christianity. So that was where Christianity was literally working at its peak powers.
Wow.
And whilst it was working at peak powers, you saw this corresponding boom in innovation, technology, industry. So we can show the correlation between this powerful cultural technology versus this physical manifestation of industry and technology and railways and steam and coal usage and so on and so forth. And this incredible explosion which spread globally.
Right.
So the problem is that, again, you're not just looking at the rise of civilizations, but you're also looking at why civilizations fall, or why they disappear, or why they disintegrate. For most civilizations, it's rarely because of other external civilizations or forces. Most of these big, powerful civilizations like Britain always decline and implode from within.
A wonderful explanation. Do you feel that it is, once you remove the religion and the impact, that it loses the societal strength? Because I love studying religions, and when you take a look at the Muslim faith, it still has it had its startings in in the Old Testament. When you take a look at all of how they got started, and you take a look at the Jewish faith, absolutely wonderful. I love studying them. I love talking to everybody, regardless of their faith. And then you take a look at how those three are all related, in their beginnings. But like in the U.S., we have lost our Christianity. We have lost our path. The Muslim faith, the good Muslims that I know, are great, great people. But there's a stigmatism with the not so good Muslims in what they have done. Do you feel that? And I do love everybody. I'm a humanitarian kind of guy, and I want to talk to everybody about their religions. But the dad's not in the homes, now we have anarchy running around, and the UK is the same way with a lot of that. Is it the miss of no matter what religion it is? Do you feel that could be part of it?
So we're getting to the root of it. So what in order to study civilizations, their rise and fall, you have to understand human nature, right? You can't disassociate the two. Okay, so the rise and fall of civilization is based upon temperament. Okay, in layman's terms, we can define that as character, attitude.
Right.
Okay, so temperament is the psychological and emotional foundations of personality, right? Underpins our behavior, virtues, vices, morals, ethics, even how we structure the economy and choose our governments.
Right.
Okay, it really shapes us and our culture right down to our DNA. So what tends to happen is that civilizations rise in working boots. You've heard this phrase before, and they decline in kind of pink, fluffy slippers, right? So, the young elder generations are working hard, right? And they're building and they're working their backsides off, blood, sweat, and toil, right? And they kind of build everything up and they hand it over. And, let's face it, kind of my generation, Generation X, and all of the younger generations, we've never had it as good. We've never had it as good. We don't know how to struggle, how to suffer. We don't really understand the meaning of it. And so we've become very liberal because we've been so successful and all of the wealth generated. And, if you think of kind of Western civilization, which is distinct from the modern West that we have today versus, let's say, Greece or Rome, right? So, Greece was successful in its own right. Okay, Rome took it to another level. We had a Dark Age, we had the medieval era, we had the Renaissance. Western civilization rose to prominence and dominance, right? Way past the Chinese, which will come on to kind of Confucianism and what's happening to China downrange. So, and then, we have these terrible world wars. And you guys said, okay, right, this is insanity, this is madness, we're taking over now, and we're going to just kind of put our own rules in, and we're going to try and take things to the next level. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, the liberal world order was insanely successful, but the problem is when you become incredibly wealthy and you see these dense urban cities, you look at New York with millions and millions of people living on top of each other, you've got all of this wealth. At some point, that wealth and that urbanization is going to impact how you think, feel, and behave, right? So in the 60s, there's a very famous scientist, a biologist called John Calhoun, and he ran a series of experiments in the 60s called and in fact, these experiments were nicknamed Mouse Utopia. So he simulated a mouse utopian society, like any city that we would find in London, in New York, and wherever, right? Paris, etc., etc. And within a very short space of time, the mice were disease-free, predator-free. They had luxury apartments to live in. They had abundance of food. They could mate whenever they wanted, and they did that, and their population exploded. But the problem is, once their population exploded, their character, their temperament changed, and things started to go into reverse. And this is without any external impact or influence. And their population just crashed, and they burn out. That was it. They just wiped themselves out, right? And so. Yes, you shouldn't extrapolate too much. You can't say, well, that's what's going to, just because that happened to mice, that's what's going to happen. That's the same phenomenon that's happening with you. But there are some scientists and there are some suggestions that, maybe this kind of behavioral sync phenomenon is happening to us, right? It happened to Britain. It's happening to you guys in America. You go to some of these cities now, and again, I don't want to get involved in the politics, and we're just trying to, we're trying to be, like I said, these aliens, these autists. We're just literally trying to find out what's actually going on in reality, right? Independent from whether you're on the blue tribe or you're the red tribe. It's just what is going on. And so, if you can see these cycles of civilizations, you can also see arcs, right? And if you think about it, most normal people who are just living their lives, they don't think about anything going on past their own lifetime, right? So they don't really, maybe they'll, if you think about cycles, breathing cycles, sleep cycles, calendar cycles of weeks, months, years, but they're not at all familiar with any cycle that extends beyond their lifetime. And therefore, they can't see arcs either. But obviously, as you know, if you study any empire and you go back, you can look at a histomap of 4,000 years, you'll see that no civilization has made it, right? They all cycle, and every empire arc. So if our theories are correct, because this is the whole point, it's what's the point in being a civilization cycles analyst? Well, the whole point is that we can make predictions in the future based on what's happened historically, right? And we're trying to make really accurate predictions. So to answer the question, many suspect, and there are many scholars that have really attempted to tackle kind of this niche for thousands of years. Some of us believe that maybe we can see these other signs that are becoming clear now, and this kind of, we can see these problems within civilization, and interestingly between civilizations, which forms the basis for geopolitics, right? So we can look at the map and the global map, and we can see what's happening in Ukraine. We can see what's happening maybe in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East. So I think the best framework, because everybody's consents there's this disturbance in the force, but they're not able to make sense of it. And that's what we come in, right? So we say, look, here's a framework within which hopefully you can make sense. This idea that, the West has ruled supreme for 400 years, right? So prior to that period, or Europe kind of dominating, it was China. And then all of a sudden Europe overtook China, and the Chinese were like, wow, like, these guys were living in mud huts and dark age conditions, and then all of a sudden they overtook us. And in fact, the CCP, the Communist Party of China, maybe 20, 30 years ago, they tasked their social science teams, scientists, with figuring out why it was that Europe overtook China, rising to power and prominence, right? And when they reverse engineered our civilization, at first they said, we thought it was your politics, we thought it was your military, we thought it was your technology. And then they said, we realized we got it wrong. For the past, 10 years, 20 years, we've realized it was your social fabric and foundation for life. It was Christianity, which is an incredible realization, right? So if you think today in the liberal world, we don't need religion. It's this ancient relic. It's patriarchal, right? It's useless. We've got it all figured out. We don't need God. God is for weak people. And there's a good case to be argued that maybe the foundations, therefore, of our civilization are not as secure now as we perhaps thought they were, and we've left ourselves dangerously vulnerable, right? So I can see these clear parallels with maybe the Western Roman Empire, right? When you look at maybe America as the spearhead of civilization, you can kind of see the same cyclical phenomenon playing out. So the key, or the challenge, or is to try and figure out, is this cycling phenomenon actually happening to us, and where on the cycle, and what does it mean, right? Relative to other civilizations who are also going through these kind of same processes. So it's never ending. It's incredible. There's so much material to look at. And if you think about it, there are 7 key areas that shape the fate of any civilization. And of course, the first one is family. So we spoke briefly about the nuclear family. Can we see any problems in that area? Education. How's the educative system doing? Britain, in America, are we producing enough scientists and engineers, or social media influencers and superstars, right? Relative to maybe other civilizations who perhaps are trying to get ahead. We're looking at arts and entertainment. We're looking at the business community, the corporate world. We're looking at government, right? We're looking at media. Do we trust our mainstream media outlets today? Are they giving us misinformation, disinformation, good information? So, like I said, we are like early warning radar,
Nice.
or sociological seismologists. So one of the two, and we're just trying to make forecasts and predictions. They're not always accurate. We don't get it right, but that's the fun. Here we are having this conversation, trying to
Oh,
make
yeah.
sense of what's going on. So
Okay. Look, I just love talking about this kind of stuff. And let's talk about energy as a whole has helped society elevate out of poverty. And you take a look at the Industrial Revolution, it was coal and steam and all of that. And then that migrated. We were killing the whales for whale oil. And then, oil saved the whales. As we take a look at energy has been so important, it's affected everything. It's affected your comment was wonderful about the generations. My granddad came in on a covered wagon, and he was in the Oklahoma land rush. My dad did not have a indoor bathroom until he was 16. He had an outhouse. They were farmers. They were not wealthy. And then you take a look at me and my kids. You're describing that, and my business partner is a millennial. He's one of the hardest working millennials I've ever met in my life. He's a rarity for other millennials that I have dealt with. I'm a baby boomer. I could retire, but I'm having too much fun. Now,
right.
You described everything right along. And the millennials, the Gen Z, I'm afraid of. Now, let's go to the energy side. That wasn't a bad analogy, was it, Daniel?
No, that's a great analogy.
And so, okay, so let's go to energy. I firmly believe that the Ukraine war, Russia and the UK, Germany, and the rest of the EU had failed in long-term contracts on natural gas. And so Russia took advantage of that. And so, the fluctuation and the energy prices on natural gas and everything else. And then we have, so all of this comes in. NATO is being really, really political in there. Russia, and I don't want to get into Ukraine and the US, but there's appears to be a lot of corruption, and funding of weapons labs if all this comes true. I can't blame Putin. I don't approve of Putin, but I can't, he's taking care of Russia first. Now, is he a good guy? No, I think he's pretty evil, but he's taking care of Russia first. Dropping over to Saudi Arabia, I applaud the Saudi leadership because they're funding their green and initiatives, and they think in years and decades, very much like the Chinese. They think years, decades, and the Americans only think every 2 years. And I mean, we are so short-sighted, we are idiots. And so when you take a look at Saudi Arabia, they're phenomenal with thinking in the long term. Now, do I agree with everything they're doing? No. But they are doing Saudi Arabia first. And so where do you see, we haven't talked about this, but the decline of the British pound, and then you take a look at the US dollar I think it's teed up to go away. I mean, it will no longer be the international standard, and people were saying, it's going to be years. I think that the weaponization of all of the sanctions that the idiots at our leadership have been doing is forcing BRICS. You have Brazil, India, China, South America, and you have all of that kind of stuff. So they're meeting, I believe, next week, and so or the week after, and they are bringing out a gold standard. The U.S. went out a bazillion years ago under Nixon. We got rid of the gold standard. We've been printing money ever since, and you can't print money. So I guess my real question is energy forward thinking. Where do you see the U.S. losing so much of its power with the dollar going away? The dollar is going to lose. It's already happening to the U.S. And crude oil is no longer. People are going around the U.S. oil dollar, and they're going around. They're now trading in rubles and won and all that. And I mean, BRICS is gathering steam. What do you think about BRICS and accelerating that?
Right. Wow. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there. So let's compartmentalize. So let's separate. And these are great questions. The energy dimensional component to civilizations is really important. Okay. And I want to make a distinction for your audience between the impact energy has on our modern advanced civilization versus the civilization cycle. The civilization cycle simply means, we are the common denominator, right? So throughout history, and in fact, slavery was a form of energy, right? Until steam, coal. That's why all of these empires and civilizations, long before the West came along, had slaves. They basically were coal, oil, and gas and fossil fuels, right? So it's really interesting because you have this forces of the civilization cycle. We will cycle biologically. It's an innate thing, and that's just always going to happen. Environment, child rearing patterns, strategies, and cultural technologies really impact the fate of civilizations. But energy in our modern world is a really important thing. If you look at population growth just over the last 200 years, it's literally vertical. So we went from, look at 10,000 years of population growth. We're kind of trundling along. We're kind of living in line with our access to energy resources. And, we harness steam, coal, and then boom, right? We literally go vertical. We go from 1 billion to 8 billion people on the planet. Okay, so this is a huge, whichever way you look at it, this is exponential growth on steroids squared. Okay, and that was only because of fossil fuels. So cheap, easy access, energy dense coal, energy dense oil, uranium, gas. So in order to power just to stand still, for example, in the United States, as you guys are kind of plowing through maybe 18, 19, I don't know what the specific figures are now, 1 million barrels of oil per day, right? Every day, just to stand still. Okay, that's without any additional development, right? The world probably consumes somewhere in the region of maybe 90 to 100, maybe 100 million barrels of oil a day. Okay,
about 100, and it's going up. Even with renewables.
China now is set to come up to parity with your economy. You're turning over. You're generating trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. The Chinese are also plowing through enormous quantities. So between you and China, you're taking maybe like somewhere in the region of maybe 40% to 50% of the world's total supplies of oil, right? It's so what's the point that I'm getting at? That when you look back at the 2008 global financial crisis and you ask many analysts and researchers and experts and economists, and you ask them, what was it all about? The conventional answer will be, it was a subprime crisis, right? Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they were lending out dodgy mortgages to people. But actually, the unconventional explanation, you can actually go back to around 2005, and you'll remember when I think it was Brent crude reached about 140, what was it, $148 a barrel. Right. That was the first, as far as I'm concerned, that was the first, as an analyst, that was the first warning shot across the bow of civilization, of our modern advanced civilization. If you think about it, those kind of high energy prices targeted the weakest points of the economic system. The financial system merely masks the finite physical nature of the world that we live in, right? We've got so sophisticated in London, in New York, on Wall Street. We built these layers upon layers of financial products and systems and services and solutions and derivatives. But really, fundamentally, what matters is food and energy, right? Food and energy and water. And that's how it's always going to be. So it's interesting to me that with such high energy prices, what it was signaling, the economy was signaling, look, we can't cope with such high energy prices. Something's got to give. It was the subprime market led to the implosion of, you know, the shadow bank, the entire shadow banking system, Ben Bernanke, we all remember it well, etc. That kind of just, it was like the world was ending, right? And we never really recovered from that. And in fact, the only reason that we did recover was because you guys innovated and you say, hey, we can now actually, you know, through fracking and innovative oil extraction methodologies and technologies, and you had the Canadian tar sands. So to my mind, this signaled that we're not just eating, you know, we're not just scraping the barrel, maybe we're eating the barrel, right? Maybe that's what it signifies, that's what it signals. So to me, that was like, you know, the first warning shot across our bow that maybe something was going on in the energy markets. Then on top of that, you have this whole kind of climate change debate and phenomenon going on, right? Which again, it's a kind of partisan issue. If you're part of the blue tribe, you're all in on climate change. If you're part of the red tribe, it's like, hey, this is all nonsense.
Right.
Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Again, if you're kind of thinking holistically,
right.
Maybe Elon Musk says it best, right? So he says, you know, maybe we're changing the composition of the atmosphere in ways we've yet to fully comprehend. It's reasonable. We went from 1 billion people to 8 billion people in the last 200 years alone. We need an enormous amount of fossil fuels just to maintain, you know, kind of our advanced and modern lifestyles. And it's incredibly, as you know, incredibly energy intensive. Like incredibly energy intensive. And you know, can we sustain our modern civilizations on solar, on wind power? You know, it's taken us 200 years or so to kind of build this fossil fuel, industrial, technological, informational economy. If we start kind of messing with these foundations, can we change in time? Have we left it too late? Are we doing enough? Are we moving too hard? Now we've got this net zero phenomenon, right, where Western governments have set themselves by law these really, really, really stringent targets. And the question is, you know, is that based, you know, are we moving in the right direction based on reality? You know, how, like, this is the debate I have with a lot of people. And my fear is that both can be true. You can agree that maybe we're changing the composition of the atmosphere in ways that we've yet to fully comprehend. But fossil fuels are also critical, mission critical to everything. I mean, if you, as you know, especially in your energy show, you know, everything requires a form of fossil fuels, right? All our goods, all our services, our food. I mean, you know, 40% of food production globally needs fertilizer. Right. So this is my greatest concern, is that now you kind of bring in the geopolitical dimension. OK, you guys, if it really hit the fan, you've got enough reserves to kind of fall back on. Right. So you can experiment with maybe the whole clean tech kind of EVs and solar and wind and so on and so forth. And if it all goes wrong, you've got resources to kind of fall back on. Britain, we've kind of expended a lot of the North Sea oil, right? Europe is in real trouble, right?
Right.
Europe's they've really got the continent has got enormous questions to basically to answer, and maybe this conflict in Ukraine has now kind of compounded the challenges and problems, because Russia was a main supplier of natural gas.
Right.
So I think that and let's be clear that maybe when we talk about the European Union, to my mind, Germany is the European Union, right? So if Germany is going to deindustrialize because of its energy crisis, you cannot defy the laws of physics, as you know, energy, laws of physics, right? You energy return on energy investment, if it's falling, then you stand a very, very low chance of maintaining.
Daniel, all of your comments are spot on. A couple of weeks ago, whatever it was, month, Germany shut down their last 2 nukes. Last week, there were things coming out saying that now Germany is importing so much of France nuclear energy. Germany is building their LNG imports for the U.S. Spain is now the largest LNG importer. You nailed everything in there. So, hats off to you for saying all of that stuff that you just nailed. Sorry for giving you a compliment, but holy smokes, you're on target on all of this stuff.
Right. So I think so. The energy dimension is, as somebody who studied civilizations, energy is the thing that powers civilization. It was Bill Gates that actually, said that, and he's right. It's like whatever we do, we need consistent, stable supplies of energy, and otherwise we cannot defy the laws of physics. So, even now, for example, in Africa, we can start to see, there are conflicts in the Sahel region now. So again, these are part of this wider geopolitical confrontation, this clash of civilizations, right? And France is getting really nervous because maybe 20% of its uranium, for example, is coming from the Niger region, and obviously now you've got this coup, and this is another thing, by the way, that we predict. So because really, if you think of the United States, I'd argue that let's look at the current kind of clash of civilizations and this kind of challenge to the rules-based liberal international order. So maybe Vladimir Putin is to the liberal world order what Donald Trump was to America. They were both wrecking balls, right? So Donald Trump came along. He was a symptom. I don't believe Donald Trump was the cause of all of the problems. I think he was a symptom, right? In the same way that our equivalent in the United Kingdom was Brexit. There was this frustration that maybe globalization and universalism, it wasn't, not everybody was being lifted up by it, and maybe there was a segment of the kind of city class, the cosmopolitan class, that were kind of running away and having a great time around the world, and then you had the kind of bulk of the population which was left behind, right? So to me, the kind of the Vladimir Putin phenomenon, the Donald Trump phenomenon, the Brexit phenomenon, the kind of symptoms of the same problem. But the problem with Ukraine is that if you think about it, kind of you had COVID, coronavirus. Joe Biden was parachuted into Washington, into the White House, the executive branch, and then you had this kind of tensions kind of building again in Ukraine, in the Donbass, between Zelensky, between the Ukrainians and the ethnic and kind of the Russian speaking population, and I actually predicted, I said, now that Joe Biden is kind of in power, I wonder if Ukraine to me just seemed like the most likely hotspot. I had no idea how bad a hotspot it would become. And then I also predicted, if that's true, we're likely to see accelerating inflation, right? And to me, this is a kind of energy triggered inflation. it doesn't surprise me that the Federal Reserve was panicking. The Federal Reserve was forced to basically slam on the brakes, and no one was wearing any seatbelts, right? We've all gone crashing through. And if you look at how quickly they raised interest rates and to their level, it's never before in history has interest rates been raised so quickly. So as you know, there's always a lag. It's always a year or 2 years down the road before we really feel the impacts. Okay. And it's still not solved the problem of inflation. Inflation is still running away. So how much more of this can we take over the next few years? And my greatest fear is that because of the energy challenges that we're facing, and certainly in Europe, definitely in Britain, I mean, in the last 2 to 3 months, food prices have gone up by nearly 20-30%. Right. It's so there's a phenomenon in Britain, in Europe, called shrinkflation. Right. So food products are getting smaller, but they're becoming more expensive. Right. And how long can that go on for before products start to vanish off the shelves because all prices have to just keep going up and up and up. So it's a huge social problem that I see on the horizon. And I think that, like I said, this has been going on anyway. So even before the crisis in Ukraine, you had this whole net zero push, which is going to add a premium. If we're going to move away from fossil fuels and we're going to try and make these transitions, things are going to, there's going to be a premium, there's going to be a cost, and things are going to get more expensive. So I wonder whether we've literally reached the end of the kind of peak of our civilization. It was Emmanuel Macron that kind of said it. He said, look, you got to be prepared for the reality is that the good times are coming to an end, and you don't know how good you've had it. And so that's what we're looking at. We're kind of just looking at what's happening within civilization and between civilizations, and that's before we talk about China, right? We've not even got to China and what's going on with kind of with their civilization and
holy smokes.
So it's these are probably the most exciting times to be alive, especially if you're interested in civilizations and historical tipping points. And I think that the party is only getting started, right? So I think, like I said, and that's why on my LinkedIn profile, I have kind of the Titanic and the Ark, right? So what we're trying to find out is, okay, who's the Titanic and where's the Ark, right? There's two beautiful ships there.
Great point.
Right? Yeah, so imagine you're at the port, you've got this kind of wooden boat, and you've got the Titanic. Let's be honest, most of us will get on the Titanic, right? And this invincible, unsinkable ship, and it's sunk on its maiden voyage. And then later, even 100 years later, the Titan then implodes as it's going down. So no lessons were learned, right? And that's why history is so important, because
in understanding God, because the Ark was God influenced. I mean, there is the difference right there. The Titanic was man influenced, and the Ark, when God told Noah, "Hey, Noah, go build the Ark."
Right. So what's interesting, I mean, my grandparents were Church of England, but my dad, he was atheist, right? He said, hey, like after World War One, baby boomers, he's like, we got it all figured out. Someone must be lying. It's all a load of rubbish. Don't worry about it. Fine. And I think that, a lot of people are kind of just starting to say, hey, you know what? Maybe there's a lot of wisdom in these old books. And if we just kind of open them up and you start to read about and learn about human nature, and you say, wow, these things have happened before. And so that's why I use this kind of Ark analogy, because I think there's a lot of wisdom. I call it, there's a difference between liberal logic and biblical wisdom, right? I have a problem with liberal logic in that, Thomas Cole kind of alluded, he was a very famous English American painter, kind of 19th century, and he actually painted The Course of Empire, right? I don't know if you remember these five oil on canvas painting series, beautiful pictures in New York, in Manhattan, I think they are. And he basically saw what we study, what we talk about in books. He actually painted this out, The Course of Empire, these stages. Wow. So you can imagine that, America in its ascendancy, no one was thinking about kind of the fall of civilizations. You guys were saying, hey, now it's our turn in the sun. We're rising. You kicked the British out. You declared independence in rights at 1776. But, you guys kind of have been a representative, or, a kind of republic, a democracy for, coming up to 247 years, right? 1776, 2023 is 247 years. So if you start to study kind of some of these cycles theories, you can get some really, really powerful predictions of what may be about to happen. It's not ordained, right? So it's not, we're not saying, and that's the key. It's never ordained. It's, but sometimes, you kind of read these history books and you go back and you almost feel like a bit of a spectator, right? So you're just watching everybody make these same mistakes repeatedly over and over again. So there are so many different dimensions that we can go down, but energy is a big one that needs to be watched very carefully. If we get it wrong with energy, as you know, then the ramifications of that are severe.
I got two things. We're just about out of time, but Daniel, I want you back. I want to finish our conversation. I'm enjoying this way too much. And this is just cool. I think this is going to be fabulous for our channel listeners and everything else. You brought up a fantastic point with inflation, the Fed trying to solve it. In my opinion, everybody's saying you just got to raise the interest rates in order to try to solve inflation. You have the jobs. Our jobs numbers in the U.S. is very low. Well, there's a abnormal number of people having to have two jobs. And because they have two jobs, it's giving a false number. I believe, in my personal opinion, the only way that we can solve the inflation issue is to get energy under control. The only way that we can do that in lowering the interest rate, stimulate business, lower taxes, and then and really price out and get the lowest kilowatt per hour, as you and I talked just before the show, lowest kilowatt per hour to all people of the planet to eliminate energy poverty, and it has to be the least amount of impact on the environment with the no printing of money. Well, I think we ought to use renewable, but we can't print money. We got to let the markets decide. Right. So all that being said, I think that we are in trouble.
Yeah, it's look, you guys, I mean, America is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, right? Britain is also an enormous, we used to be creditor nations, right? And now the roles have reversed, okay? So, China also has its own problems. I mean, they we have this whole dimension with the United States and China. I think that there is an enormous amount of global debt. And I think that at its heart is, and I agree with you, we have a serious energy problem. Right. A severe, and it's getting worse and worse and worse because we have to find ever greater, if the world population is growing, we've got to find more and more energy. It's got to be cheap. It's got to be easy access. And, we cannot defy the laws of physics, right? We are bound by our availability of energy resources. So I think the most important, listen, it's a problem. The civilization cycle is a huge problem because our temperamental set point as a species is very low, right? We want to be hunter-gatherer. That's our default setting. And it doesn't take much of an environmental kind of shakeup to send us flying back in the wrong direction. Now, the problem with that is, if we go back towards hunter-gatherer direction of travel, unfortunately, we don't have the brain power that we need to handle incredible complexity. We need smart scientists, engineers, business innovators, entrepreneurs, right? So anything that undermines that, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to maintain civilization sitting on the internet, social media influencers. That ain't going to cut it, right? So it's a double whammy. We have an energy crisis. We have a debt crisis. It's a triple whammy. And we also have this kind of cycling phenomenon. So,
wow.
Listen, it's the next couple of decades, I think, are going to be insane. Things are going to manifest, and I'm not smart enough to predict how things are going to unfold.
No.
What I can say, there's a difference between hope and faith and optimism. Spengler called optimism. Spengler used to mock kind of this idea of being optimistic. He actually called optimism cowardice. It's just basically another way of cowardice. But
right.
Hope and faith is different. I think that we need to be anchored in reality. We need to accept and to kind of face these problems head on. And we need a heck of a lot of hope and faith, which is where maybe kind of the old religious books are quite useful. So, instead of being atheistic, maybe it's better to be agnostic and just be open-minded. You don't have to kind of return to the Bible, but just be, I think it's always good to be open-minded. Remember at the beginning, 2 hemispheres of the brain, and just kind of step out of the
right.
your kind of cocoon, mental cocoon or mental prison. So I am a big, we need clean technology, but we need to find, kind of, like I said, these energy sources that are, if we can find an energy source that surpasses the energy dense, rich fossil fuels we've been used to, it's the holy grail, right? That's the question. That's the genuine question. It's, can we do better than fossil fuels? And so we're going to, that question will be answered, I think, soon.
Daniel, thank you so much for stopping by the podcast. I have about another 6 hours to talk to you about, and I'd love to have you back next month and kind of pick up our conversation. How do people contact you, and what are the kinds of things that people can use you as a resource?
Right. So right now I'm just on. I use LinkedIn quite a lot. I think there's quite a good standard of kind of people on that network, and that's about the only social media that I do.
Okay.
So if you have a look at me there, just kind of put the link in, and just join the network. I call it the network, and we kind of look at. We're looking at past, present, future, and trying to make sense of it. It's a great crowd. It's people from all over the world, all different cultures. So we're just trying to kind of get to the truth of things, right? And so that's where you'll find me on LinkedIn. And
fantastic. We'll have that in the show notes, and I hope you can come back soon, because I've got about another hour to talk to you on everything else, because I'm not done with you. Sorry about that, but I just thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.